Hello and welcome to Say That Again Slowly, the Cambridge Festival podcast where students interview the experts who have contributed to the festival. We try to pair up students and researchers from very different disciplines to bring things back to basics. There are no stupid questions here. This year's theme is power in all its forms, from nuclear energy to medieval saints, from the history of money to the biology of extraordinary animals. I'm Amelia and I'm a second year undergraduate studying English, and today I'm interviewing Dr Lea Niccolai, who will be presenting a talk as part of the festival titled The Last Pagan Emperor, Understanding Julian the Apostate, on Monday the 20th of March from 1:15 p.m. to 2 p.m. Hello Lea, could you please begin by introducing yourself and what you're going to be talking about at the festival?
Of course. My name is Lea. I am an assistant professor in classics, and my specialty is late antique history, late antique to early Byzantine. And on Monday, I will be talking about this quite unique figure in the history of the Roman Empire, that is Emperor Julian, the so-called apostate. And I will be trying to put him in context, so to speak.
For those listeners who may not have heard of Julian, could you maybe sketch us like just a brief biography and like what, for example, is an apostate?
Of course. Apostate is a word meaning in Greek something like the betrayer or the traitor. And this refers to the striking fact that marks Julian's life. He is a Roman emperor, but he is born in a dynasty, the dynasty of Emperor Constantine, in which the emperors have already converted to Christianity. So Julian is raised as a Christian, the first dynasty of the Roman Empire, which this happens. And then at some point in his life, he decides to go back to the traditional Greco-Roman religion. So he leaves Christianity and he goes back to the religion of the past. And for this reason, his detractors started to call him very early on an apostate, so a betrayer. And Julian is somebody who lived actually a very short life because he died when he was probably 32, perhaps 33, we don't know it exactly. But after, he has impressed so much, he has had so much impact on the history of Rome because even though his rule was very short, he actively tried to both to reform a traditional Greco-Roman religion and to make it the official religion of the empire once again. So this elicited multiple responses and made of him a towering but also controversial figure among his contemporaries.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Why did you first get interested in studying Julian? What drew you to him?
I was actually interested in other topics related to the Greco-Roman world, but then I just happened to read a historical novel, which is called Julian. It's by Gore Vidal, the famous American novelist, and it blew me away because it's a really a magnificent account of Julian's life. And I have to say also a very accurate one because I reread it after graduating, and it just made me realize how much research Gore Vidal put into his reconstruction of Julian's life. So yeah, after reading that, I thought, why not giving to Julian a go? And I've been working on him for a few years now.
Oh, it's really interesting to hear like a piece of literature sparking you to then like take an academic dive into a figure.
Yeah.
So Julian he's known mainly for being like the last pagan ruler of the Roman Empire. And I was wondering if you could maybe explain a little bit about how Julian would have understood paganism. Does it differ from our understanding today? Because I think it's quite a difficult concept, maybe.
It's an extremely difficult concept. We could even say it is both an umbrella concept because it brings together a variety of religious allegiances, but it's also, we could say it is an external denomination and a derogatory title in a sense. Because what we need to understand is that the Greeks and the Romans did not describe the religious allegiance in the way in which we might want to do in modernity, in the sense that there was no way to say, in the way today somebody would say, I'm a Jew, I'm a Christian, I'm a Muslim, I'm a Buddhist. There would be no way to say, I have an allegiance to the Roman gods, because I didn't feel the necessity to do so. So what happens is that at some point, when Christianity begins to take over, and does so by defining itself in opposition to other religions, it is in a sense Christianity in the Roman Empire that begins to give a label to those who do not belong to, and pagan becomes one of the possible labels to describe those who aren't Christians. There is also others, like in the Greek half of the Roman Empire, you would simply describe a pagan as a Hellenist, or a Hellene, actually. So somebody who was very much invested in Greek culture, we would say. But the thing is that paganism could describe very different ways to believe in the gods. And for Julian, actually, his religion is basically a unity with Greek philosophy. So he was extremely devoted to a sort of mystical evolution of Platonic thinking that we usually refer to as Neoplatonism. And Neoplatonism was at the same time, according to our modern categories, a religion and a philosophy. So that was his side of.
No, thank you. That was really useful just to hear it explained. I guess what I found quite interesting when I was doing a little bit of reading before this is, and you've kind of touched on it already, the fact that he's the nephew of Constantine, who's the first sort of Christian emperor. And you were talking about how he is schooled in Christian religious doctrine, and then he ends up rejecting it quite fervently. And I was just interested, do we know why he became so opposed to Christianity?
Yes, this is, it is actually the topic of my talk, and what I try to
Don't want to spoil it.
Yes, a spoiler alert. Yeah, but it's actually also what I try to argue in my research, that there is a very close correlation between his interest in philosophy and his reaction against Christianity. So what we need to understand is that in the moment in which Constantine becomes the first Christian emperor, this is actually in many respects a sort of subversive gesture, because of the importance that traditional culture and traditional religion had at court. So we could even speak of, if we want to draw on the category of the cultural capital. When we think of the Roman Empire at this time, it is this huge territory in which a sort of trans-regional elite is especially invested in thinking of themselves. I mean, what they find the unity in traditional culture. So if you are an emperor who buys into a new religion, a religion that doesn't stem from the traditional culture, you know that you are treading you're treading on shaky ground, if that's an expression, if I'm not using a mixed metaphor here. But Constantine knows it, and also his sons. We can see, if we study, as I try to do in my research, if we study the propaganda, the way they spoke of themselves, we see that they were constantly putting an effort in saying that they were Christian, but they were very connected with Greco-Roman culture. And in particular, which is the crucial point, their Christianity gave them a better understanding of traditional culture, a better intellectual control. So this is, for Julian, what is extremely problematic. The idea that, now I'm slightly simplifying things, but the idea that this external system might simultaneously want to claim superior insight into the culture of Greece and Rome, and at the same time might be dismissive of it, insofar as the point then for Constantine and his successors is that of saying, yes, we control this culture, but the gods that are part of this culture are not what we want. We want a different divinity. We want to say that the meaning embedded in this culture actually points to a different type of universal truth, cosmic truth. So as a philosopher, Julian finds this a sort of inconsistent argument, or the deployment of even, intellectual tools, metaphysics developed within a Greek culture system in the Platonic tradition, in the service of something that is external to it. And my point, more or less, is that if we want to use a sort of anachronistic category, but my point is that Julian is in a sense accusing Christianity of cultural appropriation. So the idea that it draws on instruments that are not its own, and then it denies that it's using those instruments.
I mean, that is really interesting because I feel like throughout the history of Christianity, that's something that like consistently flagged up. When when you look like at the moment, we've been doing like sort of Victorian literature, and we've been looking at like sort of like missionaries going abroad and spreading Christianity, and it's the same sort of fears that they're sort of erasing the culture, but they're using the sort of cultural practices to spread Christianity, but at the same time denying it. So it's really interesting to think about that as a debate that was happening so long ago.
We could say two things though. I guess or as a follow-up, the first is that maybe to some extent what Julian doesn't see is the degree of interconnectedness, syncretism, dialogue, exchange. That so I guess that a form of mutual influence were sort of inevitable, and maybe Julian himself is a bit blind to the way in which Christianity influences his thinking. But then what you were saying about the missionaries, I think, in a sense, there is the eternal problem of anchoring what you are bringing into a new environment, into a different environment. And one of the ways through which culture is anchored is also that of, trying to connect it to things that people are familiar with, that make them feel comfortable. So I think it's part of it.
So after he becomes emperor, he obviously starts on this, I don't know, would you call it a religious reformation? This idea that he's going to try and limit the power of Christianity. And I was wondering, could you tell us a little bit more about the sort of changes that he implements in order to try and achieve this goal?
Of course, and I would say that here the point of power is central. The premise is that actually Julian doesn't get the chance to do much, because as I was saying, he becomes sole emperor in November, and then of the year 361, March 363, he's dead. So it's not much that he manages to do. But why do they say that power is central? Because I think Julian sees something that prompts him to pursue his religious reform. I think what he sees is the beginning of the separation between state and church, and also sort of power struggle between them. Because in the moment in which Constantine attaches the church to the empire, he also, in a sense, gives up. He gives away what had been throughout Roman history, the absolute control on the side of the emperor of the religious life. The emperor was Pontifex Maximus. He was the highest religious office, and so emperors until Constantine had a complete control of the religious life of Rome. With Constantine, this is not possible anymore, even though he tries to maintain this control. He presides over religious councils like the famous one of Nicaea. But the thing is that he doesn't have what Christian theologians call apostolic authority. So he doesn't have the sort of legitimacy to do so that is theorized as coming directly from the apostles to the bishops. And I think that Julian reforms are reflective of this division, this first division between political power and religious power, which brings many tensions between the emperor and the bishops already early on. We should be saying this. So Julian sees this tension, and his reform could be described as an attempt at hyper centralization. So he is again in absolute control. He appoints his priests personally, as we can see from his letters. He communicates with them. He tells them how they should behave. And he also tells them, which is equally important, what they should be reading. So Julian writes a sort of literary canon for his priests, the priests of his reformed cult, because he thinks it is of absolute importance that the priests keep up Greek culture. That's what we were saying before, like culture is very much embedded in his understanding of religion, so they must read especially Plato and a series of other things from the Greek past. Yes, and they must do philosophy. So he also writes religious hymns to various gods, to Helios, so to the sun god, or to the mother of the gods, who is Cybele, a sort of syncretistic divinity. And these hymns are profoundly philosophical, because that's how he understands that religious should be done.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I would just to say, no, just as a wrap up, he dies, and none of this remains, of course.
Yeah, because one of the things that I came across, and I might be wrong here, that he sort of establishes this idea of like a pagan welfare system in the pagan temples, that this idea that the Christian church was using charitable activities to spread the faith. And I thought that was really interesting because again, it's something like you see in England after like the dissolution of the monasteries. But like a lot of people after that, they struggled because they were getting support from those monasteries. But it was also like another way in which Christianity was spreading its power. And I was wondering if you could tell us any more about this. I thought that was a really interesting idea.
That's a crucial point, and I have to say it's also a very controversial one, because the problem here is that I mean you're right. Julian writes this, or we assume that he writes it, in the sense that this plan to organize charitable activities in competition with the Christians is something that we read in one of Julian's surviving letters, letter 84, Bidesquimont. And the problem is whether this letter is authentic or not. Scholarship is extremely divided on this point, and I do personally believe that it's a forgery. Or at least that if there is a sort of Julianic text, it was heavily rewritten by some later Christian. Because if you think about it, it is a strange text. In which Julian formally says bad things about Christians because it's how he's supposed to speak, right? He's supposed to criticize them. But the substance of the letter, in fact, pays a compliment to the Christians, because it says that they are those who are organizing charitable activities, and they're doing it so much that in the letter it is written they're actually even taking care of the pagans, not just of the Christians. So it is, I mean, the document has other problems. It's not just that. There's a number of problems in that text. But it says essentially sort of it voices a complex of inferiority. And you can imagine that is something that would have pleased very much any Christian reading that Julian the Apostate actually was trying to keep up with the Christians but couldn't quite. So I do think it's not authentic.
That's really interesting. Because I think it's really interesting talking about these actions and how we can interpret them. Because I'm wondering, is there any way that Julian could be seen as a defender of religious freedom, of religious tolerance, or is it always this motivation of limiting the power of Christianity?
It's this is another crucial and controversial point there, or maybe complex, because there may be something that we should state at first is the question of whether religious tolerance was actually a value at all in antiquity, in the same way as it has then become in modernity. But we need to think that actually the assertion of the Roman power was something that was built in the image of Roman emperors. The idea you have all these coins in which there is not necessarily in the Roman world the sense of the value of accommodating, of giving space, and we do find appeals to religious tolerance. So it is to some extent a concept, but usually it comes from oppressed minorities. So we have early Christian writers saying you should not be forcing religion on us. But they're also saying it because what then they add afterwards is you shouldn't, because we are right. And once we take over, you will see that we're right. So it's always extremely competitive. So how does Julian fit in this very different framework? Julian does not persecute, does not enforce, religious persecution. But even though there is a Christian tradition that creates stories of Julianic martyrs, but these are later fictional stories that really want to drive home the point that he was bad, and so he was persecuting. They're not historical. But what Julian does is to actively try to refute Christianity and to sort of discourage people from joining in. The interesting way is that he does it through culture. So he writes a philosophical treatise against Christianity, which is called Against the Galileans, because he's also trying to undermine Christianity's claims to being the universal religion by saying, no, look, you come from a specific region that of Galilee, you are a sect, you are nothing more than a sect. And you also, probably also that is a debated point. He issues a sort of school ban in which he tries to prevent Christian professors from teaching the classics, but this goes back to what we were saying before, that he doesn't want Christianity to control traditional culture. So the question is this tolerance or persecution? Well, if we frame this in this way, it's difficult to reply. But what is certain is that Julian does not do what past emperors had done with the Christians. He does not initiate any form of centralized persecution, govern-led persecution. Also because it would backfire. Yeah.
It's interesting to think like how modern debates and concepts might not match up with the past, like the sort of the dangers of being a bit anachronistic. I think it's really interesting what you're saying about how it's very much his plan is being driven through culture and cultural changes. Do we have any evidence to like how people at the time received these changes? Is he I know he's not on the throne for he's not ruling for very long, but is he a popular ruler? Do we know?
Probably not very much. The moment of Julian's greatest popularity is when he... something interesting in his life is that he reconquers Gaul, because it's the early stage of his political rise. As soon as he's appointed co-emperor, or sort of subordinate emperor, he is sent to Gaul, which at the time was being invaded, if you want to use this term, but by Germanic tribes. And he defeats them, so he restores the Roman government in the region. And at that point, he's extremely popular, which is at least among his soldiers. So, which is the reason why they appoint him Augustus, which means that he is not anymore a subordinate emperor, he is a full emperor, let's say. And this is something that his co-emperor of the time finds very problematic, and so there's a fight, not quite a fight, but anyway. After this moment, I would say that Julian's popularity will decline over his year and a half of sole emperorship, and this is evident in the final months of his rule, when he's based in the city of Antioch. There was a Greek-speaking city in Asia Minor, in modern-day Turkey, and there he's really trying at this point. He has committed so much to being perceived as a philosopher on the throne, and it just rubs the citizens of Antioch off in the wrong way. They begin to write, sort of mocking songs against him, against his long beard. Probably they also complain because he sacrifices too much, and so the end of Julian's life is not. He has lost his popularity.
That's interesting. So do you think it's probably likely that even if he had lived, he might have failed in his attempts to stop the spread of Christianity? Because I found this book when I was looking at this fiction book called The Dragon Waiting by John N. Ford, which is a sort of a fantasy alternate history. And it has the reign of Julian as the point of divergence. So it imagines a reality where he doesn't die quite young. It's a long reign and he's successful in stopping the growth of Christianity. And interestingly, the characters refer to him as Julian the Wise. But I thought it was interesting, this idea that, do you think it could have gone either way in terms of the spread of Christianity, or was this plan to limit, was it always going to fail? Like, is there an alternate reality where Christianity wouldn't be the dominant religion as it is today?
So Julian is the king of counterfactual history. Really, I think I'd heard of that novel, even though I never read it. But I think there is more. There's a whole genre of counterfactual history with Julian as a protagonist. I personally think that he would not have been successful even if he had lived for, I don't know, 90 years. And the reason why I think that is that there is a problem embedded in Julian's reform, or at least there's something that he fails to do. And this is that probably the force of Christianity at that stage was that we have been speaking now of Christianity's cultural discourse. So how Christianity would speak to the elites. And we have been saying that in Constantine's effort and the efforts of other rulers after Constantine was that of presenting Christianity as very compatible with elite culture. But the point is that Christianity was also able to do the opposite thing. And that is, it was very capable of speaking to the people at this point, the sort of consolatory or force. And in a sense, it has been argued that at the time of early Christianity, there is what Peter Brown, a famous historian, calls the invention of the poor. What does he mean? It's not that the poor didn't exist before, they always existed in history, but Christian priests, politician bishops begin to incorporate them so much in their politics and the rhetoric. They make them visible, and in this way they really mobilize a sort of army in their support, the urban army. It is striking to see how much popular resonance religious disputes would have when Constantine summons the Council of Nicaea and decides that he needs a sort of firm reply on the question of a specific heresy, that is Arianism. He does it also because the dispute over Arianism was causing enormous trouble in the city of Alexandria in Egypt, because people were literally fighting over this theological matter. So what I think was missing in Julian's reform was the sort of popular side, or the capacity to appeal to the people, to speak to the people. He was invested essentially in the upper class cultural discourse, but he couldn't talk to everybody, which is also the reason why he was not popular with his own citizens at the end of his life, because they saw a philosopher on the throne and they didn't know what to do with that.
That's very interesting, that idea of like being too closed off, and the reforms that he was bringing not improving or not making life any better for the average ordinary person. Yeah. I was very interested too in his name, so Julian the Apostate, and as you sort of really brilliantly described earlier, it's quite a negative name. It's like the betrayer, the traitor. And obviously this is a name that he's sort of been given within the Christian tradition because he rejects Christianity, so he's called the apostate. So it's kind of, in a way, I don't know if you agree with me, but it's kind of a name given to him by the winners of the debate. And it's interesting to maybe, if he had succeeded, what his name would have been like. But I was this idea that names have power, and I was wondering whether you think that this name, naming of Julian, has come to dominate like perceptions of him. Are there things outside of the religious changes that he should be remembered for? Is it a slightly limiting name?
Oh yes, it is of course, and I always wonder, but I think that all scholars of Julian wonder if we should keep using it or not. I mean, in academic writing, nobody really uses it, and we usually speak of Julian, Emperor Julian, Julian Augustus. But then when you are sort of bringing Julian outside of the of articles and monographs, it is inevitable to call him in this way because it's how he's known, right? So if I just said I'm going to talk about Emperor Julian, maybe people might be, who's that? But so what else Julian should be remembered for? I think his imperial profile is absolutely extraordinary, just in terms of what he writes as an emperor, his literature. There hasn't been any other emperor in the history of Rome writing in the way he does and exploring so many genres and making them. I mean, he really personalizes them, and I don't also think, I mean, I might be wrong here, but I don't think there has been any other ruler afterwards. I mean, writing the same things, writing in the same way. Julian is sort of obsessed with autobiography, I mean, for obvious reasons, but his autobiographical obsession leads him to do things like he writes a satire on himself and on his beard, the famous misopogon. So I don't know how many emperors in the history of any part of the world have written a satire on themselves. He writes a satire of the history of Rome, which is actually, I think, also simultaneously a sort of philosophical statement, which is called The Caesars. He writes, as I was saying, a philosophical treatise against Christianity. He probably wrote poetry that was lost. He writes the only surviving, maybe only existing, prose panegyric to a woman that from Greco-Roman literature, that is a panegyric, a praise in honor of the Empress Eusebia. So he's the only one who does that. And so he's an extraordinary author.
That's really interesting. The one about the satire about himself, I think like it was translated, the title's like The Beard Hater or something,
Yeah.
which sounded brilliant. Um, yeah. To take a slightly different line of approach, I mean, Julian, he's a historical figure, but he's one from, thousands of years ago. And I imagine that studying someone like that, it could be quite hard to separate the real person from the myths and the perceptions that sort of spring up around them. Like I know in your talk you're going to be looking at how he's like hated in the Middle Ages, but he's really loved in the Enlightenment. And it's not a problem that's unique to classics, but I guess I'm interested if it's something you're especially aware of with classics because you are going back so far. Like, can we ever get close to the real Julian?
That's I mean, I imagine the answer must probably remain open here. We can try to understand him better. I don't know if it's ever possible to. I mean, this reminds me of what we were saying before on anachronistic statements, and there is a part of me who thinks. I mean, I ask myself if it's ever possible not to be anachronistic in the sense that we are always importing in texts from the past, in realities from the past, what our worldview and the way we filter things. But I think that maybe in the case of Julian, we have an advantage point, perhaps a slight one, I don't know, that there is so much contemporary evidence in the sense we don't only have the history of the reception of Julian or later fiction on Julian. We have a lot of that too, but we have Julian's own writings, and then this other very important piece of evidence, let's say, is the most famous work of historiography from the 4th century, so from Julian's time, by Ammianus Marcellinus. Ammianus Marcellinus is a key historian of the time, and he's also a sort of biographer of Julian in a sense, whom he knew personally because he was a soldier under Julian. So he saw him do lead the army or do politics. And he tried to be reliable as much as he could, sometimes even criticizing Julian, even if he admired him at the same time. And then there is other contemporary evidence. It's a bit of a patchwork, but I think that with Julian we can do a better work than with other figures.
It must be interesting too, like taking a figure who seems to attract a lot of attention. Like we've talked about how as history passes, he's been viewed differently. I guess it also must be quite interesting then trying to like sort of put that to one side and look at what the evidence is actually telling you about them.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think just as a side note, maybe, speaking of his reception in the Middle Ages and in the Enlightenment, in this respect, if you think that the Enlightenment really loved Julian because they saw him as somebody opposing Christianity and in defense of philosophy, therefore rationality. But what we were saying before is, what does it mean to be a philosopher in Julian's times? And Julian is as committed to religion as any Christian theologian of his time. So he thinks of himself as prophet of Apollo and son of Helios, among other things. So yeah, it's...
Yeah, while we're talking about like conventional reception of Julian and how he's been seen, I know that this is something you're going to touch on in your talk, so we might not want to go into like loads of detail, but you're going to be challenging sort of a conventional reading that's seen him as a figure of sort of towering isolation. And I was wondering if you could maybe like just expand a little bit on that, because that seemed really interesting.
Of course, I mean, in a sense, I already went through my point, because what I mean is that because Julian is so unique in the way he writes, in the fact that he comes to be the last pagan emperor, he tries to resist against something that we tend to see him as an exceptional figure, which he was. But he was simultaneously, and this is my point, he was simultaneously a very alert and careful reader of his times. Like, his point is precisely that of saying, I mean, why does he commit so much to his idea of being a philosopher on the throne? It's not because he's trying to, revive a mythical archetype in a time in which nobody was interested in philosophy. It is precisely because his close predecessors had sort of been trying to do the same, but from the viewpoint, from the angle of Christianity. So they said that Christianity, as I was saying at the start of the interview, in fact, dominated the Greco-Roman cultural landscape. So I think we should stop seeing Julian, or this is my, in this way I make it sound like a plea. This is the argument of my book. I think that Julian is not somebody who lived in a world of his own and who wanted to be like Plato. I think that Julian is very much connected with what politics is saying in his days.
Yeah, thank you. And again, I hope that people can maybe come along to your talk and hear you talk more about this, because it sounds so interesting. We've touched on a little bit how Julian is this amazing writer and he produces these texts, some of which we still have today, and that it really displays his skill as a writer, which in a way, it's kind of fitting then that he seems to have been a very popular, a recurring figure in the public imagination, especially in terms of literature. You've talked about Gore Vidal's Julian. He also features in Elizabeth Finch by Julian Barnes. One of my favourite poets, actually, who I didn't know, C.P. Cavafy, wrote 6 poems about him, the Greek poet who I love. But I was just interested, why do you think that Julian has this hold on literary imagination, but also popular culture? It does seem quite fitting that someone who was so interested and invested in culture has had, in turn, quite a big impact on literary culture.
That is true. I hadn't thought of it that in a sense, because Julian's world was culture. Then it is culture that sort of received him and kept him up. So I think, Julian is sort of turned into a mythical figure, not just because of what he has done, but by his own opponents. And that's part of a sort of a strategy of reassertion of Christian power after Julian, in the sense that they need to. Julian dies very young, we were saying, because he dies in a military campaign fighting against the Iranians, the Persians, and this is. Something that is used by his detractors to say that he was God's example, that you should not be doing what he had done, that God had in a sense punished him and turned him into a sort of exemplary figure, but in the negative, like. And for this reason, ironically, the Christians themselves later were interested in preserving his memory and his work and speaking of him more and more and more and more, because he served as a reminder of where you should not be going. So this is one of the reasons why his figure has acquired this sort of mythical status, and afterwards, of course, as the cultural discourse in Western modernity changed, then he has become, I mean, someone serving so many different purposes. Maybe I suppose that for now he also represents, I mean, he embodies a fantasy, that of being a young emperor who decides to go against the tide of history, also to declare who he is in a world in which that has become a problematic statement, and just commit entirely to his beliefs. So I think that this moves very much the sort of the romantic side, intended, of the fascination for the heroic in in many people.
Yeah, I guess literature also, I feel like literature quite likes the tragic figure as well. And I feel like
Yes.
there's something quite tragic, that like the unrealized, like the sort of the last line that gets attributed to him, that I'm sure we can't say whether he actually said it, where he's like looking at the heavens and he's like, you've won. I guess that idea of, like you say, a young person who has this great plan and it doesn't work, is quite alluring, maybe from an author's point of view.
Of course. So, I mean, you're right. There's this sense of tragic, maybe better than heroic, as I was saying before, about the rise and downfall. I just wanted to say, though, that in respect to Cavafy's poems that you were mentioning before, actually, Cavafy is one of the few contemporary authors who don't buy into the Julian Smith. Yeah, because I think Cavafy doesn't like Julian's religious commitment. He sees it and he thinks that Julian is simply replacing a form of normative religious discourse with another one. So he's actually quite sarcastic on Julian.
That's interesting, that like and also like being a Greek poet as well. I think that's an interesting perspective too. Just to sort of bring our discussion to a close, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about classics. So in recent years, there's been like a big push to sort of defend classics as a study, sort of emphasizing its accessibility, but also the value of classics in the modern age. I think Mary Beard, the well-known classicist, who also, like, until recently was teaching at Cambridge, has done, I think, a lot to sort of widen people's awareness of the classics. So my question kind of has two parts. Why does the study of classics matter to you? Which I know is like a huge question. But more specifically, and linking back to Julian, are there any ways in which like a study of Julian is relevant to us today? Can it inform on society today? I mean, just off the top of my head, issues of religious tolerance, freedom, they're still big pressure points. This idea of like the state and religion, should we have like an established, just within England, I'm just thinking of like the census that came out recently showing like the Church of England is no longer like the dominant religion. So I'm just like, why should listeners be interested and care about Julian, if that makes sense?
Oh, yes, of course. This is a huge question. So
sorry, just to end on a huge one.
So I hope I will make, I'm not sure I'll make justice to either, but I'll try. Well, classics and making classics accessible. This subject, the subject that studies the Greek, the ancient Greek and ancient Roman world. Yes, it's a huge one in the sense, not just because of the sheer amount of material that we have available, in the sense that there is just so much literature that has survived, compared also to other cultures, unfortunately. So we can reconstruct so much of this world, but also I guess that because of the way it has then influenced for historical reasons, yes, the history of Western modernity, it has activated so much discussion, so much conversations. It has become entangled with so many reflections, for better or for worse. I mean, either way. So the point is really, I mean, I think we have reached a point in which we are really trying together, trying to think together on, I mean, what, how can classics speak to the contemporary world? How can we remind ourselves of the the way in which it has been manipulated, but also the ways in which this historical and cultural subject has to offer to I think to I mean to anybody. It's a fascinating, really. I mean, what I personally find so fascinating of classics, I mean, of this world, is how different and how similar simultaneously can be to us. Because sometimes we connect, we read something from Homer, from Plato, or any other, we connect so incredibly with it, and then we are reminded of all the things that are in fact incompatible with us, with our values. Just think of, I mean, slavery was a normal thing for the Greeks and the Romans, sort of, or even just what we were saying before on the fact that religious tolerance was really not on top of their list of priorities. So I think it's this mechanism of seeing what's similar, what's different, that sparks so much thinking. And Julian he offers a lot of food for thought, I think, for a variety of crucial contemporary issues. I mean, some of which we touched upon today. I think from the relationship between culture and power, for me, is the key one, culture and politics, but also culture and religion, and religion and power. He sort of creates a triangulation of these three things. And yes, I mean, tolerance, as we were saying. So
that's a really interesting way, actually, of thinking about the past, in that rather than trying to like make the past fit the present, actually looking at the ways in which they differ, and that sparking interesting debate. So that's really interesting. Is there anything at all that you would like to add that we haven't covered that you think you would like to bring?
No, I think we had yes. I would just say read Julian.
Yeah, read Julian. Yeah. Thank you so much, Lea. That was really fascinating. You can find further details of Lea's talk on the Cambridge Festival website, including booking details. Make sure to follow the Cambridge Festival on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube for more fascinating events. And follow the Say That Again Slowly podcast for more conversations with this year's experts on the theme of power in all its forms. Thanks for listening.